All right. So, Chapter 9, implementing operational security. So, now that we have learned about some of the appropriate procedures and policies um, according to managing our basic security infrastructure, we're going to want to learn how to enforce security in our organization's day-to-day business operations. So first, we're going to talk about evaluating security frameworks and guidelines, incorporating documentation in operational security, implementing security strategies, managing data and security processes, along with implementing physical controls. Security frameworks. So, this is going to be a conceptual structure for security operations in an organization. So, for operational security to be effective, we can't just improvise as we go. We're going to want to have a skeleton um, to build our operations on top of, right? To make sure that they're solidified in some way. So, we could talk about we're going to talk about a few of the frameworks and guidelines that are currently available to us. Um, these are going to help us define how to categorize and identify elements of our security operations. They're going to focus on a high level. That way, we can get smaller tasks that are going to pertain strictly to our business rather than every other business out there. And then this helps us to avoid creating security in a vacuum, so to speak, where we're not thinking about things that we might need to actually think about. We might overlook things if we did not have a framework to build upon. So there are several different framework categories. There are regulatory frameworks, which flow from basically government organizations that mandate certain behavior um, that any legal entity is is subject to, and any legal entity is actually subject to that regulatory regulation. There are non-regulatory frameworks. These are typically vetted frameworks that are not mandatory. However, they're still beneficial, right? They still help get things running smoothly. Then we have industry-specific frameworks, which are usually drafted by like an organization that sets clear standards for the industry, right? And they collectively decide how things should be in that industry. And then we have national frameworks. These are constructed to apply to a specific country's laws, maybe their customs, their cultures. And so, because it's specific to countries or maybe even regions, they may not be applicable to other countries, right? In some certain countries, um, encryption is illegal, but that's not the case here, right? Um, as a matter of fact, in China, they are currently mandating by 2022, I believe, that all organizations that do business in China um, hand over their encryption keys to the government there in order to continue doing business. Um, and then we have international frameworks. So these are generalized to at a degree where they can apply to most countries, no matter what political or cultural differences they may have. So, when it comes to security framework examples, first up we have the NIST 800 series. So, NIST is the National Institute of Standards and Technology. It is actually located in the Gaithersburg area. If any, for those of us who live in the Washington D.C. area, it publishes tons of documents on a wide range of security topics. This follows from encryption standards to guidelines to compliance for any legal regulations there may be, mobile device security, cloud computing. Um, However, the one that we are talking about here is the NIST 800, which focuses primarily on computer security. After that, we have COBIT 5. COBIT 5 is a framework for IT management and governance, and it's called COBIT 5 because it has five guiding principles for organizations to achieve their IT management goals. And then next up, we have ITIL. That stands for the Information Technology Infrastructure Library. It is a IT comprehensive IT management structure that was developed in the United Kingdom. It has 5 core different publications. These focus on IT strategy, design, transition, operation, and continual service improvements. And then finally, we have ISO IEC 27001. So ISO is standing for the International Organization for Standardization, and IEC will be the International Electrotechnical Commission. So these two organizations join forces to create a standard model for information systems management. And currently, there are 10 clauses that cover things from organizational context to reviewing system performance. All right, so security configuration guides. There are many organizations that provide guides for operational security. These guides can help us strengthen our operations and make sure that we adhere to the principles that are set forth in a particular framework, right? There are general purpose guides which provide um, a high level guidance on a particular security topic, such as secure coding, right? And however, this doesn't require any type of specialized knowledge. This is overarching secure coding. So we're not going to get into how we're going to do secure coding in Python or Java or C++, but we're going to have an overarching suggestion, such as having a comprehensive application testing process, or making sure that we, validate our code and our inputs and stuff like that, right? There are some guides that target specific vendors and platforms. So the thing is, each platform or vendor will have um, its own quirks, right? So you may need specific guidelines for um, that particular application or whatever the case is, right? So a web server for web application and server guides, such as IIS, which is for Windows, and then we have Apache HTTP server, which is a cross-platform server. We'll see that like in Linux and all sorts of other things, right? These both are going to have the same basic objective, right? Each one of these server softwares are developed independently, however, and so each one is going to have its own unique issues that come along with it. So the guide can kind of help us address these issues. And then we have network infrastructure device guides. So these network infrastructure device guides, these may be something like for Cisco and Juniper, right? So each one of these manufacturers are going to build appliances to their own specific specifications. And so both of these can have an effect on how the hardware and software configurations are going to need to be set up, right? And one last one I kind of skipped over here is operational systems guides. So we have systems guides for Windows, we have systems guides for Linux, Mac, whatever else you have, right? And so everything from common security features to subsystems in an operating system are going to be dependent on, or are going to be different depending on who's created it, whether it be Windows, some type of Linux distribution, or Mac, right? So many of these guides are going to help us target that specific OS. Compliance. So compliance is the practice of ensuring that legal, regulatory, and organizational requirements are met. There are several controlling authorities that need to be recognized in order to achieve compliance. So, authorities that mandate compliance will be government and legislative entities that make the laws, such as national congresses, parliaments, states, um, state senates, anybody who makes these laws, right? And then there are government regulatory agencies that provide standards for various industries, such as maybe the coal industry or steel industry, right? Even medical device standards. And then we have industry associations. So these industry associations are going to have their own standards that are best in their business, that they believe are the best practices in that exact industry. So these laws and regulations definitely have a substantial effect on organizational security. So in this case, our security professionals need to review all the laws and regulations that are going to be relevant to their type of business operation. Um, Most organizations are going to have their own legal requirements that apply to their data systems, their controls, their infrastructures, and uh, these regulations can affect how we are going to store, transmit, and process our data. And then we're going to have our own organizational policies, which we have designed ourselves to convey our own business requirements. So we're going to want to make sure that the things that are going on in our business adhere to the policies that we've set forth. So an example of some of these laws would be something like so there's HIPAA, right? And so that's a U.S. federal law that protects against that protects the modification, the reading, and transmission of personal health data, right? Um, so I'm sure a lot of you guys have heard of that because we're all most likely clients of a specific doctor or insurance company, etc. Right? And then we have PCI DSS. So that is how we are going to. That's the industry regulations that define how we're going to process our card payments, right? And how we're going to enforce the security practices for people that are going to use card payments, right? For vendors and stuff like that. So that is the Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard, PCI DSS. And then another one that comes to mind is going to be the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. Sometimes you'll see this as SOX. So this is a federal law that's going to require public and private organizations to meet a federally mandated threshold for how they're going to secure any financial and investor information, right? They have specific times they're supposed to hold this information, specific security settings, etc. When it comes to layered security, this is going to be an approach that operational security, it's going to be an approach to operational security that's going to incorporate a whole bunch of different layers of defense, right? That's the purpose of layered security. So we're going to have multiple controls to mitigate different types of threats because our threats can become because this be because we have so many different threats, this can become complex. It could become expensive. However, it's still gonna give us the most optimal protection, most likely. So, layered defense systems can be more effective if we rely on vendor diversity, because the thing is, um, a flaw in one vendor's product can be in other products of that vendor, right? They might have a hole everywhere. Like, say, if you only used Apple products or Cisco devices, right? So these Cisco devices might have a hole that shows up in different areas on their device, right? Or on different devices, right? So in this case, if we contract with multiple vendors, we may be able to alleviate that risk. Um, However, then we also have to deal with multiple different vendors, which could be difficult to manage at some point, right? However, we could have different type of controls as well that are going to aid in our layered security. So it's not just going to be our technical controls, but we're going to have administrative controls, right? So we're going to say who can access what data. We're going to have that in policy. We're going to operate under a principle of least privilege. We're going to maybe background check our employees. Maybe we separate our roles. So that all comes into parts of administrative controls, right? Moving forward, defense in depth. defense in depth is a tactic that is going to leverage layered security, however, incorporate other policies, right? On top of that. So we are going to have, we're going to use this to plan our user training, our policy adoption, our physical protections. It's going to cover almost every imaginable area of security. So in this case, it's meant to be a fail safe. So if one part of this is breached, then the other part hopefully will pick up the slack and mitigate any threat. So in this case, we can see we have our data itself that has its own, it maybe some type of encryption or something. Then the application, maybe there's something on there. Our networks, we're making sure that people SSH into this. We have physicals, so maybe making sure that we keep our servers locked away and only certain people can access this. Policies and awareness, maybe we make sure that our employees are trained on how to spot phishing and things of that nature, right? And that's how we're going to hope to rely on multiple areas of defense. So in case one part is breached, the others hopefully are not. So you have your first activity for this specific chapter. This is going to be activity 9.1. We are going to be evaluating security frameworks and guidelines. The scenario here is Develotech wants to rework security from the ground up. Industry organizations have already created useful frameworks and guidelines. So we are going to consult the NIST SP 853, which is going to provide us some guidelines on how to select our security controls. So now that we have evaluated existing frameworks and guidelines, we need to start thinking about how we're going to write our documentation that is going to be specific to our business needs. And these documents should incorporate the best practices of operational security in order to be effective. So this is going to be a formalized statement that is going to define how security will be implemented in an organization. And that is the definition of security policies. So a security policy is going to define how security will be implemented within a particular organization. It is going to describe the means by how the organization will take on to protect the confidentiality, the availability, the integrity of sensitive data and resources. This includes like the network infrastructure, physical and electronic data applications, the physical environment. So this is gonna have multiple policies within it, right? So this is going to be similar to a government's foreign policy, right? It is going to be determined by the needs of our organization. So the same way as a nation might have a foreign policy in part because they have real threats, they also may have them from perceived threats, right? And so we are going to have our own perceived threats as an organization, and we're going to need to define how we're going to handle these threats. And this means we may have to think of all sorts of different scenarios in which there may be a threat, right? The U.S. government has strategies planned out for the craziest of scenarios, right? So an invasion from Canada, right? That is a real strategy that the U.S. government has planned out, like war games and stuff for, right? They even have stuff for alien invasions and stuff like that. So they are picking out every possible thing that could possibly happen here. Now, we don't need to go that far, most likely. However, we will need to anticipate threats rather than simply react to them, right? And that's what would happen if we did not have a policy already in place to deal with a multitude of different threats. So when it comes to security policies, we are going to have something like this. So this is a Develotech's password policy, right? So names what the individual policy is, and then in the overview it states what resources we need to protect in this case for this policy. So it's a quick overview of what the policy is, a little bit of background information, right? So it says the passwords are an important aspect of computer security, and they are the front line of defense for user accounts. If we choose a poorly chosen password, this could compromise the entire network, right? We don't want to put password as our password. So as such, our employees are going to be responsible for making sure that they adhere to the guidelines on how to select and secure these passwords, right? And then we have a formal policy statement. And this is going to tell us the purpose of this policy. And the purpose of this policy is to create strong passwords, protect these passwords, and we are always also going to set the frequency of change, right? Because many of you may have noticed a lot of websites now and organizations mandate that you may have to change your password every 30 days, 60 days, 180 days. As a matter of fact, I believe that Montgomery College is making us change passwords like every 180 days, right? So the scope of this policy is going to be anybody that has an account, right? And that on any system that resides in any Developtech facility, or anybody that has any access to the corporate network or stores any non-public company information. So that is the scope, right? It's pretty much everybody that has anything to do with Developtech's information or company, right? And then we have our implementation measures, which are underneath the policy specifications, right? And then we have our specifics on this, right? So everybody who has a system level password, such as a root privileges, administrative privileges, they have to change their password on a monthly basis, right? And when we change our passwords, it's not so much that, well, it's not at all that it's because it's more secure, like it makes it harder to crack a password. The purpose of changing your password on a monthly basis, 160-day basis, 365-day basis, is that we are creating we are giving attackers a running target, right? If we just sit there and stand still and never change our password, well, at some point the attacker may have gotten our password, and then they will be able to will be able to persist in our network because we never changed the password, right? So that's why we create new passwords. It's so that we have a running target, and in case they already have our password, well, now we have a new password, right? So next up, it says that all user level passwords, such as stuff for the desktop computer, web, email, these got to be changed every 3 months. So these people aren't as seen as much as a threat to the company as people with the system level passwords. So we're in this case going to make them change it every 90 days. All right, and then they're also saying users that have system level privileges, such as root and all that, they also need to have another password for a regular user account, right? And I had a student that had something like he had previously been a system administrator. In this case, where he had just previously left from, he had a total of 11 different accounts that he had to have passwords for. So he had system administrator accounts and user accounts that he had to do specific tasks for. So this can become a little unruly to manage. However, it is something that is providing the best security at this moment. There are ways to try to manage all of these passwords for sure, but we do need different passwords for different user privileges and responsibilities. All right, so common security policy types. So we have our acceptable use policy. So this is going to state the limits and guidelines that are set forth for our users and others who are going to make use of an organization's physical and intellectual resources. So this is going to be our rules of behavior for those personnel that use those resources. So it should define what use of resources is going to be acceptable and what's not. So it should define what use of organizational assets, such as maybe the computer, cell phones, telecommunications equipment will be acceptable, and what is considered unacceptable and in a violation of policy. So we have to also keep in mind, however, that they must be reasonable and respect employee duties and their rights. So maybe we will allow personal email use, or maybe we will not, right? Because at the same time, when we allow personal email use, um, they may start using that email everywhere online, right? And then that kind of opens us up to targeted phishing campaigns in that way, right? Um, and then that will inadvertently let somebody into our network. So we got to kind of make a balance there. Then we have our privacy policy. So this is going to define standards for divulging organizational or personal information to other parties, right? And it should specify what is to be kept secret and what is not, and what are the consequences of violating that privacy policy. So users need to understand what workplace actions are and communications are what are to be considered private and what are not to be considered private. And when it comes to consequences of the policy privacy violations, one thing in particular, uh, children, right? You ever notice how online where children, um, it says you have to be at least 13 years of age to use this website or to create a profile, etc. Right? Well, if those policies, if that wasn't set forth in the privacy policy, the federal government actually gives out like a $10,000 fine for each time a person under that acceptable use age um, uses one of these websites without it being specifically stated in the policy that we are not allowing people under 13. So there are consequences for these violations, and may not only be a company consequence, but it may be a government regulated consequence, right? Then we have our audit policies. So this is going to detail the requirements and parameters for our risk assessments and the audit of our organizational resource sources. Our password policy, this is going to define the standards for complexity and strength, and it's going to define how we're going to use password security. So securely. So in this password policy, we might say, okay, change your password every 30 days, change it every 160 days. We might also say, okay, well, it needs to be they need to be a mix of letters and numbers and special characters and maybe no dictionary words, right? Um, so that would all be identified in that password policy. And then maybe on top of that password policy, we also say, a lockout period and everything else, right? Um, then we have our wireless standards policy. So this is going to define what devices can connect to our network and how to use them in a safe manner um, on our network. So maybe we're going to say that we don't want any outside devices connecting to our network because that constitutes a security threat, right? Or maybe we do allow them, but we need to have that on our wireless standards policy, right? Maybe you're only allowed to connect to a guest Wi-Fi and not the actual Wi-Fi that is connected to the backbone of our organization. Um, then when it comes to a social media policy is going to define how an organization and its employees are going to use social media, such as Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, TikTok, even, right? So social media is a good effective tool for sharing information and maybe marketing products and stuff. However, this can also mess up our organization's reputation, right? We don't need our employees posting negative content, right? Because then it could look like we stand behind that content if we were to allow our employees to do such. And you can see this all the time, in which employees are fired after posting uh, social media content that which could be considered inflammatory, right? Um, I've seen that a couple times with ESPN commenters. Um, so the policy needs to be hopefully specific to our platform, but also, I saw one where NASA decided to fire somebody who had just been hired because they posted crude comments online, and NASA felt as though that wasn't representative of their organization. So keep that in mind, but also keep in mind like what people share on social media, right? Maybe they're sharing information that can give an attacker actionable information on how to attack our network, right? Um, so all of that needs to be in an account. When it comes to personnel management is going to be the practice of ensuring that all of an organization's personnel are actually complying with our policy, right? Um, so a personnel management program is going to outline the various tasks and practices that an personnel should carry out in order to protect our business operations, right? So every user is going to play some part in security. Uh, as we remember, right, the human element is the most vulnerable part of an organization, especially when we're talking about social engineering, because humans are tricked all the time. Not too long ago, there was a shark. One of the people on Shark Tank. They were their one of their assistants were socially engineered, in which they were scammed out of $400,000 after pretending to be the one of the Shark Tank CEOs online. They were able to convince one of their assistants to wire over $400,000 to them. So that was a that was something out there for the entire world to see there, just for the simple fact of how popular Shark Tank happens to be. I believe they got their money back at some point, but I didn't check too much further into that, but that is one good example that you guys may have seen in the recent uh, time frame. Next up, we have a separation of duties. This is the practice of dividing duties and responsibilities among individuals, right? So no one person should have too much power or responsibilities. Our duties need to be divided among individuals to prevent any ethical conflicts or potential abuse of powers. So our duties such as authorization and approval or design and development should not be all held by the same person, because it's easy for them to exploit the organization into using software that may contain vulnerabilities, or maybe or maybe just getting in a good position to where it just benefits them, right? Maybe they're doing time cards and stuff like that, but also they're doing payroll, right? And they can just add as much time as they want to themselves and then get themselves paid, right? So typically we're going to have a different role for each person. So one person for backup, one person for audit, one person to restore, right? And we'll see that as well in like I said earlier, like pay organization. So one person is going to do the payroll, but another person is going to sign the checks, right? So we just are trying to cut down on potential abuse of powers in this case. When it comes to job rotation, this is going to be the practice of ensuring that no one person stays in a vital role for too long. And once again, this is uh, typically to prevent an abuse of power. However, it's going to help reduce boredom of employees, because a lot of times, you know, when things get stagnant, we start to lose our morale and things like of that nature. So rotating we're going to be rotating individuals into and out of different roles. So maybe the firewall administrator becomes the access control specialist. And this way, we're able to ensure that nobody's is too firmly tied into um, a specific role, right? And then also we can spread knowledge among our employees and enhance those individual skills. Mandatory vacations. So this is the practice of mandating that an employee take some specific amount of vacation time each year, right? And this is gonna the purpose of this is not for your morale in this case, This is not to boost morale for it can have the effect of that, but when it comes to the Security Plus, and the reason why we're talking about here is it provides employers the opportunity to review an employee's activities. So in this case, we can audit that employee while they're gone and discover any discrepancies during that time. So when we do this, we the chance of fraudulent activities goes down. Um, I had a coworker who had previously had a coworker of her own who was telling me a story in which one of her previous coworkers was a payroll person or finance, and what they were doing was they had never taken a day off um, in over 20 years, and at some point they got sick or their husband got sick, and during that time they were able to audit that person, and once they audited that person, they found out that they had been stealing from the company from for that entire time. So at that time they they were removed from the company. However, they were also ended up given prison time for that. Um, a little anecdote here. I believe I heard a large amount of firings happen after a vacation. So I'm not sure if that's just anecdotal, but um, it seems to me that that mandatory vacation is revealing more potentially bad habits, which in turn shows itself off in the firing of those employees after the organization has come to realize maybe some discrepancies that have been happening while they were employed, and they were able to shine light on that while they were gone. Um, additional uh, additional personnel management tasks. So um, we have tasks that we may want to incorporate into our security policies. First up, we have background checks, right? So these background checks, um, one, they're going to ensure that the prospective employee doesn't have a criminal record, or at least a extensive criminal record. Um, it also ensures that maybe they don't have a poor history with a past employer that may, because the inappropriate past behavior could indicate flaws in that person's character, and that could lead to risk for our organization. So, for some jobs, this is mandatory that this happens, especially in federal jobs. And in order to get your clearance, that would be mandatory. Now, there are levels to as to how clear somebody needs to be, and keep in mind this background check. They are also checking out your FICO scores, right? So this background check, if you have a poor credit report, this will also show up in a background check, and you will not be cleared depending on what level you're going for. I used to have a supervisor on Fort Meade who was actually my supervisor for close to a year before her complete background check came through, and she was demoted after it was revealed that she had credit issues, ongoing credit issues. So that is a potential flaw, a red flag, especially with these security clearances, because that means maybe you are not dependable, trustable, because you're not paying back um, the creditors at an appropriate time, but also it can reveal the potential for blackmail, or that you could be bribed, right? Because you are not financially secure, and people who are not financially secure may be more susceptible to bribes, right? So that will mess up your security clearance. Signing an NDA. So that is a non disclosure agreement. When an employer or contractor signs an NDA, they are asserting that they will not share confidential information with a third party. So if they break that agreement, they may face some sort of legal consequences, right? And so this is going to act as a deterrent to violating trust. So there are NDAs signed all the time. Uh, as a matter of fact, I had to sign an NDA to attend an a meetup at um, Amazon's one of their headquarters in Northern Virginia. So the second we walked into the meetup, we had to sign an NDA at the security checkpoint. So this some of these NDAs may result in legal troubles. Maybe you'll get sued, but also some of these A's might have more drastic consequences, such as jail time when we're dealing with federal organizations, right? Three-letter agencies. Um, onboarding. Onboarding is going to require account management tasks. So onboarding um, is required when you bring on new employees. We're going to want to make sure our employees are made aware of all relevant policies that they're expected to follow. And our new employees need to have resources in order to comply with these policies, right? We should give them those resources and maybe a checklist or something that of best practices, etc., right? And then to get people started. But also, we want to make sure our onboarding is correct, right? Um, I have been reading recently in which somebody was getting onboarded by their company as a database developer, and in their onboarding packet, telling them how to get set up, they um, they were given usernames and logins that actually were like high privileged logins on the onboarding paperwork, and the person accidentally deleted some of the databases and was then fired and told that legal action may soon follow. And so the problem is here that onboarding should have never um, had such credentials printed on them. So it's not so much the employee's fault in this time, but a total lack of awareness when printing that onto their onboarding paperwork. Um, and also security, right? Uh, that's just for everybody, and they shouldn't. Nobody should really know those credentials except for those who have been authorized to know that, right? Principle of least privilege. So, exit interviews. So this is occasionally part of the offboarding process. Um, in the military, they would call this a debriefing. Um, so an organization is going to receive feedback that is used to improve future employment, right? Maybe ways that what did you think about your employment? What are things we could do better? What things do you know that that can help us for our future employees? So we're trying to salvage any specialized knowledge that that person may have that they got through that experience. And also, the exit interview can reveal behavior of a disgruntled employee, right? And that is particularly necessary in this day and age. It's 2020. This is America, and people do shoot up the workplace when they're fired at times, right? It just recently happened in Milwaukee after somebody getting fired. So maybe strategize how you're going to conduct these exit interviews, and that way we can alert um, any necessary authorities to potential threats in that manner, right? People that may seem unstable and may constitute a physical threat to our other employees and organization. Training and awareness. So, as we said before, personnel are the weakest link, right? Strong technical controls are going to be pointless if a single user is careless, right? And to mitigate this risk, we have um, we have several management tactics that we might want to employ to ensure that our personnel are given the security training they need. And the security training can come in different forms, right? It could be an instructor-led classroom experience. It could be a computer-based e-learning type experience, kind of like what you're doing right now. Um, it could be taking exams to certify knowledge, kind of like the Security Plus that you're taking, right? It could be one-on-one knowledge transfers through a mentor or something of the like, right? Um, and so, whatever delivery method we're going to end up using here, we need to know um, that a that it's not static, right? That things are always going to be changing, and we need to ensure that our personnel are receiving a continuing education because there are ongoing emerging cybersecurity issues that are going to affect them in the future. And so our education needs to be ongoing and not static. Um, Overall training um, should include awareness of threats and ways to protect end users. So, for example, we need our users to be aware of social engineering attacks. We also need our users to be able to spot phishing emails. Montgomery College usually sends out phishing emails to its employees. I've received several of them. I remember specifically on one, they gave out a report saying that something like 1,000 employees received the email. Something like 600 people ignored the email altogether. 100 or something uh, reported that email as phishing, and then another 300 people actually gave credentials and clicked on the emails link and gave up their credentials. So in this case, they needed to be properly trained to see those phishing emails and be aware that there are social engineering attacks just like that. Recently, I just got a new one from, I believe it was Montgomery College, because I kind of spotting these by now. They were, otherwise, it was just somebody else trying to phish me. But it said that I needed to click the link and give up my password in order for them to perform an audit on my password to see that it was in compliance, right? And so, no, that is a trick. If you see something like that, know not to give up those credentials because somebody is trying to gain your username and password, right? And you are giving it up freely. So that is a clear example of a phishing attempt. Then we have specific roles, right? Role-based training. So this is common, right? So we might have users that need to have general cybersecurity awareness training. So like we were just talking about, how to spot social engineering, how to spot phishing, right? Just general employee information. Then we have privileged users. So these privileged users need to receive training on how best to handle their privileged additional network and systems access, because as a privileged user they will be more of a target, right? Because people hackers are going to want to have that privileged status, and they may not necessarily get that by going through your average user, but uh, spear phishing a privileged user might actually give them what they want. Executive users definitely need to be know how to train spot targeted attacks. So our executive users, they're going to be the people, our CEOs and things of that nature, right? And so just back to the Shark Tank one, I imagine because the attackers in this case had gotten into the Shark Tank person's email account and had previously seen where the CEO had asked their assistant to wire over some money. So at some point they were able to get into that email account, I imagine through some sort of phishing attempt prior, and then they used social engineering to then email the assistant and ask for another $400,000, and then simply try to cover the tracks by deleting that second email, right? So in this case, our executive user needed to know that people are going to specifically target them and ways that they may target them. And then our assistant, in this case, we can look at her as a data owner, right? Because she has that sensitive information she sent out, being wiring money, right? She needs to receive training on how to best manage that sensitive information. So maybe there need to be policies in place on when we are going to be wiring money. Maybe we need a vocal confirmation, or maybe even a confirmation, a physical confirmation. Maybe if you're in a different area, maybe we confirm this through a Skype chat or something of that nature, right? We need to see the other person. But there's other ways they could probably have done that too, biometrics or something like that, right? And then we have system owners. So system owners, they need to receive training on how to manage their particular system, and our system administrators need to know how to best configure and maintain these systems, right? How to secure our system, how to harden our system correctly, right? And that needs to be specific. Now, your average Joe doesn't need to know how to harden the system. However, our system administrators definitely need to. Our executive probably doesn't need to know how to harden all of our network, right? All of our routers and stuff and like that. But our system administrators definitely do. Our network administrators, etc. Then we have business agreements. So all of these will definitely be on your test. We have different types of agreements. So we have a service level agreement. That's going to be a SLA. This is an agreement that is going to clearly define what services are to be provided by the client and what support is going to be provided as well. And so our resources can include everything from hardware and software to human resources, right? What personnel we are going to provide to another organization as defined by the service level agreement. So this SLA is going to define our basic expectations for liability purposes. So this is a legally binding document. Across your test, you may come up with something saying, okay, it might give you 3 or 4 of these and say, okay, which one of these are legally binding, right? SLA is one of them. ISA is one of them. MOU, generally, no, it would not be. But moving forward, then we have a business partner agreement. So this is an agreement that's going to define how a partnership between 2 business entities will be conducted, right? It's going to define what is exactly expected from each entity in terms of maybe security or finances. And for security purposes, we need to describe exactly what the partners are going to be sharing with each other and how our inter-organizational access is going to be handled, right? And so we'll see this with our governmental agencies, right? That, and I also with ISA. A lot of times, right? But we also probably we probably seen BPAs with somebody like Samsung and Apple, right? Because Samsung was providing a lot of the chips that Apple was putting into their cell phones. I'm not sure if they are currently, but not too long ago they were. Then we have a memorandum of understanding. So this is going to be not legally binding for one. So if you come across one talking about what's legally binding, this is not one of them. It does not involve any exchange of money. They're less formal than a regular contract, right? But they have significance, right? They're a way to express desire to achieve a goal in the agreed upon manner, right? Um, they're they're basically just a mutual agreement, a little more than just a vocal agreement, right? So they have no legal foundation, so they're not secure though. And then we have an interconnection security agreement. This is the type of agreement that's geared towards the information systems of partnered entities to ensure the use of interorganizational technology is going to meet a certain security standard. This is going to be legally binding, and it's going to focus heavily on security. This is another one that we may see with governmental organizations, cross-sharing information. I remember a big thing with 9/11 was the fact that they said that a lot of these governmental organizations may have known about oncoming attacks, but they didn't share the information with one another because of the way they were set up. So one of the things that was done in the wake of that was to make sure that these 3-letter organizations could cooperate with each other and share information more readily. So we have a guidelines for incorporating our documentation in operations security, right? So we are going to want to ensure that we have a security policy driven by our business and security needs, right? If we are a security focused company, or we are somebody that does a lot of research and development, or dealing with a lot of money, we're gonna want high security, right? However, if we're just a mom and pop shop, most likely getting a whole bunch of security measures. These security measures are not typically the cheapest thing around, right? So we need to get something that fits our needs, right? And remember, with more security comes less accessibility. So we need to understand and balance that. We also need to ensure that the policy describes the goals. Any policies, not the policy, but any policies describe the goals and requirements for our security operations. That way, everybody understands what needs to be done and why. Um, so we need to consider creating supplemental policies of specific types. So these are going to be things like AUP, right, and password policies, right, that are underneath other specific policies. We're going to want to incorporate management tasks in our security policies. Personnel management tasks into our policies because we want to make sure that we add um, management controls in addition to our technical controls, right? We want to consider separating duties among different personnel and consider mandating job rotations. So this is, trying to make sure that no one person gains too much power over our organization or system, but also trying to spread knowledge, right? Um, Also, consider mandating vacations for our employees. Somebody could have been stealing from you for the last 20 years, 30 years. So we want to make sure that we're able to audit those employees while they're gone. But also, as a plus, maybe it does help with morale. But remember, for your test, it is if they ask you why you might want to consider mandating employees vacations, it's not so people get rest and relaxation. It is so you can audit them. Um, Consider implementing background checks, non-disclosure agreements, and other management tasks. Remember, if we're dealing with security here, and so it is when it comes to security clearances, that background check is not just making sure that you don't have a criminal record. So if you're sitting here thinking, "Oh, I'm clean. I've never done anything in my life. I don't even have a parking ticket." Well, guess what? Um, if your FICO score is a 400, you are not getting cleared. Um, Implement a security training program for all personnel. So we want to have a security training program based upon what their position is, in addition to overarching training, right? That's kind of like what we're doing here now. So Security Plus is a uh, broad test, right? It's overarching. We touch on technical details and policy and everything else. And a lot of you may not end up in a technical role. Maybe you end up in HR, or maybe you end up in somebody that's drafting security policies. Well, that's why we are going to have an overarching one in addition to more specified training, right? We also need to ensure that personnel training is ongoing. Why? Because our training, our threats are constantly evolving, right? The same threats that existed 50 years ago are not the same threats that we're facing today, right? Um, a lot of the encryptions from like the 90s and the 80s can be cracked today, right? With a cell phone that's in your hand. Consider offering different training programs based upon roles, which we already talked about, and consider how business agreements can facilitate interoperability. So, these business agreements can make things a whole lot easier for our companies to cooperate with each other, and we can establish what our expectations of one another. So, that is definitely something that we need to consider. So our next activity is going to be incorporating documentation in operational security. So, um, Develotech has had several issues with personnel behavior that has put the organization at risk. For example, employees are sending sensitive data, files and passwords over email, right? And hey, why might they be doing that? Maybe we've given them free range over their email, right? That they can use personally. So that might have been something we wanted to say that was not acceptable in our use policy, right? Employees are using weak passwords. Well, we should have had that covered during our password policy, but also we would want to have put in technical controls on there that disallowed them from using weak passwords in the first place. Um, Employees leaving sensitive paper documents and USB drives on their desks, right? So anybody can walk by and pick up their password or other documents which may lead to a breach, right? USB drives that may contain sensitive data, somebody can just walk on by. Employees are using workstations to play games, download copyrighted material, and download malicious software. Where, of course, the malicious. So maybe first of all, we should have had a policy in place that we're not going to be using these computers to just download whatever off the internet, right? Or maybe we throttle or disallow peer-to-peer sharing and torrenting. Um, Employees using workstations to play games. I mean, they probably shouldn't be doing that at all at work. But especially if they're doing something online with those games, that might constitute a security threat. Downloading copyrighted material, that is a threat to our business, opening us to lawsuits and things of that nature. And then malicious software that they're downloading, because they're downloading everything apparently, can be in everything. Can be Trojan horses, viruses, whatever. And all of these things are a threat to our organization and may open up a back door for any attacker to just walk on in. So Developtech definitely needs to get a hold of the reins in this case. So that's all going to be coming up in your security policy. You're going to define how employees should or should not use company property. And we'll look at some of the free policy templates that are available from the SANS organization. All right. So next up is going to be security automation. So this is going to be part of implementing our security strategies, because it's important for us to understand what the overarching goals are in our security controls, because otherwise we might be just wasting times on a control that has little impact on the security of a business. So these goals are going to be achievable through these operational security strategies. So one of the first of these strategies are going to be security automation. So automation can increase the efficiency of our security operations. Manual processes are indispensable to security operation, to operational security, that is, and no matter what organization is. However, the automation has the power to drastically increase the efficiency of many of these different types of security related tasks. So in this case, um, our automation will typically carry out a routine or task that has become otherwise tedious and time consuming, right? So when it comes to configuration validation, we might require that a security for personnel comb through a system and compare each individual configuration to an accepted baseline. However, we can delegate this task to an automated tool so that it saves the organization time and money, and it also is probably more accurate, right? Because computers only do what we tell them to do, right? Um, so instead of somebody going computer to computer to computer, we can automate this and run it on all computers at the same time, right? Or maybe he does it at one computer and then we control the rest of them that way, right? And then another task that is commonly automated will be continuous monitoring. All right, so this is going to be constantly scanning the environment for risks. It's the so we're going to be scanning for threats, vulnerabilities, stuff of that nature, right? So it's going to be more efficient than human-based detection. And then we can also automate an action to this monitoring, right? So we can configure our IPS as something to automatically block traffic that we have deemed suspicious, right? And our IPS meaning our intrusion protection system. Also our IDS, right? Our IDS, when we set up our IDS, we're going to have it scan the environment and maybe alert security personnel to any threats, right? And we can also use this with something like Splunk, right? And we are going to deem what things that we want to filter out for, what type of threats we want to filter through out of all of our logs, out of our thousands and thousands of logs. We might flag a certain set of these that we constitute as an important risk, and have that automated out and printed out every day or something like that, right? Um, Automation can also be enhanced through scripting, right? So we can have tools that perform these tasks on a specific time, um, given a specific condition, right? For example, we might use a script to search through a log file for a particular event every 10 minutes, right? And in addition to these scripts of automation, this can also be added to with aided by a template, right? So this template is going to provide a baseline configuration for a system or a set of systems, right? And then we can automate the process of setting up new systems with these templates rather than sitting here configuring all these systems manually, right? So that's the idea of a master image pretty much. And so this would be our ideal configuration, and then we can automatically deploy these mastered images. And that's what's being done with a lot of our virtual machines, especially here at Montgomery College, right? We have our master image, our ideal image of what all these virtual machines should start off at, and then we deploy them that way. And then these are reverted once the class is over or something like that, right? Or the next day. Next up is scalability. So scalability is going to be the property by which a computing environment is able to gracefully fulfill its ever increasing resource needs. So as a business grows, so does its workload. Scalable environments adjust to changes without any disruption. Something we might think of here with a scalable environment would have been something like Netflix, right? So Netflix went from a rather small company that originally just sent out DVDs. And then somewhere close to 10 years ago, they began streaming content. And when they first started streaming, they didn't have much available, like old Westerns and stuff like that. But then they started making deals with other companies. Nobody was really in the streaming business yet. And so at one point, not too long ago, Netflix accounted for half of all internet traffic. That required an enormous amount of scalability, and AWS, which is who Netflix uses for its content, help provide that ability to scale like so drastically, right? Because with all of the millions and millions of new subscribers as Netflix became more popular, that increased the bandwidth need exponentially, increased the memory needs, the storage space requirements. It increased the millions and millions of identities that had to be maintained for signing in and signing out, right? So a scalable environment is going to add more resources and and hopefully strengthen any existing resources. And so a organization may possibly do this by buying more hardware, or in order to have that in anticipation of expansion of that business. But that's also what's helping AWS grow, is because a lot of these companies and startups in general can't afford the amount of hardware and infrastructure that will take to be able to scale properly. And so that's where cloud computing comes in to help that. Um, but when we're dealing with scalability, we also got to talk about something called elasticity. So elasticity is going to be the property by which a computing environment can instantly react to both increasing and decreasing demands and workload. So our resource demands are going to fluctuate throughout the day, right? There's certain times that people are watching TV, right? I'm sure. Let's stick with Netflix here. I'm sure during hours where most of the United States are probably asleep, somewhere maybe between 3 and 5 a.m. Across the country. We don't have as many people logged on to Netflix or consuming our bandwidth, right? So we want to be able to scale down our operations so that way we can save money, because we don't really need to run it 24 or at full power 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, right? However, so when demand is low, then that resource can then power down, and when we can shut down some of these servers, as we kind of show here, right? And then when people start to wake up, maybe come off of work, stuff like that, then the amount of servers needed will increase, right? So this is going to support our cost effectiveness. It's going to streamline our operations and allow us to save a lot of money. Also, though, with elasticity, we may need to scale down our operations because of, disaster, or maybe even competitors, right? Maybe we are no longer as competitive as we once were. So in this case, once again, sitting with Netflix, right? Netflix at one point, as I said, accounted for all half of internet traffic. However, there are many more streaming options out there now. And because of that, Netflix most likely had to scale down their operations. And that's where elasticity comes into play. But because if they had been, if they had to have bought all those resources, physical resources and infrastructure, that kind of would have hurt their bottom line, because they've obviously had to scale down with the advent of Disney Plus and Hulu and stuff like that. So now the demand has somewhat dropped. They're not stuck with a whole bunch of servers that they no longer need. And that will go with any business, right? We want to be able to not only scale up and down when we have increased or decreased demands on a daily basis, but also as a whole, right? Because we may have good and bad years as well. Next up, we have redundancy. So redundancy is going to be the property by which a computing environment keeps one or more sets of additional resources in addition to the primary set of resources. So, in other words, a redundant system is going to create and maintain a copy of the same resource. This copy may be full or partial. It may only contain specific pieces and parts. But the purpose of redundancy is to correct any number of issues that may compromise the primary set of resources, whether that be data or hardware, right? We might have hardware, so we want redundant hardware. So that might be, an extra server that can come online when other ones are going down. So that way, we provide an appropriate amount of services without a major disruption or loss of access. Fault tolerance. So this is the availability of a computing environment to withstand component failure and to continue to provide an acceptable level of service. So in this case, we're gonna have um, we're gonna have several categories of fault tolerance. We might have one that compensates for power outages or power spikes, disk and data storage corruption and loss, um, network component failures. So the same way you have power strips at home, those are there to help in case maybe there's a lightning strike or something like that, right? And you the rest of your house lose power, and we're trying to keep a power spike from hitting your computer and um, making us lose that computer, right? We might have a compensating measure for data storage and corruption of loss, right? I'm sure a lot of you have backups. Like you may have saved something, you maybe backing up photos or something into the cloud. At this point, a lot of us are doing that, but we may have backups, for those of us who play video games and stuff like that, right? You might have several save states on that video game because something has gone wrong in the past. I know that was a problem with PlayStation 2 myself, because I used to have several different copies because of save games, because one of these things are going to end up corrupted at some point in time. So that was my fault tolerance or redundant measure in that case. And then we could have network component failures, right? Um, so in that case, fault tolerant systems are going to offer some type of duplication or redundancy in order to maintain our functionality, to make sure that we can continue to operate as needed, right? Redundant array of independent disks. So this is going to be a set of vendor independent specifications that are going to support redundancy and fault tolerance for multiple device storage systems. So in this case, if one or more of these storage devices fail, data can be recovered from the remaining devices. So RAID can be implemented through operating system software, but also hardware-based RAID implementations, and these are more efficient, and they're more common, right? There are several RAID layers. Each of these are going to provide a different level of efficiency and features. So RAID levels are going to be identified by different numbers, right? So 0, 1, and 5 are the most common. And then all RAID forms, except for RAID 0, are going to reduce the threat of loss due to system and device failures by providing redundancy in the first place. So let's see. No. All right, so let's talk a little bit about these different RAID levels, because you will see these um, on your test, right? So in RAID 0, data is written across multiple storage devices. This is called striping, right? In this case, this is going to help increase performance, because we don't have all of this on all of our data written on one device. It's striped along several different devices in order to increase performance. However, there is no redundancy of the data, right? So if one device fails, this is going to affect the entire array of storage devices, because we only had a piece of that on one of these devices, right? And then we have RAID 1. Data is going to be simultaneously replicated from one storage device to another, right? So that is called mirroring. It's completely replicated. And this is going to provide redundancy, as data on a failed device is still going to be present in that mirrored device, right? And then we have RAID 5. So data is going to be striped across 3 or more disks with one extra block of redundancy called a parity block. So this is going to provide a increased performance and ensure the data on one failed storage device can be reconstructed from the parity block and the other functional devices. Right? So a parity block is going to have pieces of data on there as well. Then we have RAID 6. That's going to be the same as RAID 5, except it's going to use one more block of parity. This is going to provide increased redundancy, as data on 2 failed devices could potentially be reconstructed from the 2 parity blocks that we created, right? And then all the other functional devices, right? All right, so non-persistence. This is going to be the property by which a computing environment is discarded after it has finished its assigned task. So typically, we're going to see these in a virtual desktop infrastructure, right? So VMs in an organization, or even a VM at your home. It doesn't really matter. So in a standard persistent mode, that's what you're using on your normal laptop, computer, etc., right? Maybe even in your VMs. When you make any changes, any customizations to your desktop or your laptop, those customizations are saved once you log off, right? They don't go away. So in a non-persistent environment, once the user logs out, the VM is going to revert back to its known state, right? To its master image. And all configurations that you made during that time are lost, right? So this is going to help us to enhance our security operations, because it's going to enable us to exercise a tighter control over our virtual environments. So if you allow a virtual environment to persist, it'll eventually deviate from the secure baseline that we had created, right? And in that case, it might actually end up becoming a vulnerability. So non-persistence is going to make sure that these deviations are temporary and that we revert back to that master image. Um, so doesn't necessarily have to be a master image. We can also um, revert back to a save state or a snapshot. They're also known as checkpoints, right? These capture the state of a VM in a particular point in time. This also applies to non VMs as well. You can set save states on your computer. As a matter of fact, as a um, as a teenager, I had to always create a bunch of save states because I was constantly getting myself all sorts of viruses and stuff like that from browsing the shadier parts of the web, and was just chock full of viruses. So I had to be able to revert back to a healthy state in the past, right? So that would be more so of a snapshot instead of reverting all the way back to a master image. In this case, we can think of our master image as the original state of the computer. I had to revert back to a certain point in time. When we're talking about master images for VMs, this is an image that we have likely set up to be our ideal secure baseline. So it might have everything that we already want on this computer already, and a secure configuration. So all the applications we want, etc., and secured the way we want in that master image. Um, and that way we don't have to go all the way back to our master image if we were to use a snapshot or a checkpoint rather than the master image to revert to. Um, we also, in addition to all this, we have something called live boots. So if you guys have downloaded Kali or something of that nature, well, particularly in this course, so we have Kali. I have a walkthrough of Kali on the inside of the course modules. So Kali Linux will allow you to install onto a virtual machine, full install. However, there is also a live mode. And I've had several users that I've had to install on a live mode because their computers just weren't letting me install Kali Linux in full on the in the virtual machine. So what we do in this case, and this doesn't have to be on a VM, but we can also enable live mode like on a USB stick. So in the VM and on the USB stick, it works the same, right? You start up the VM or you plug in the USB stick and you go directly to live mode. So live mode is an operating system that is not installed on the storage on the system itself. It runs directly in RAM. And because RAM is volatile, when we shut it off, any changes are going to be lost. So live mode is not good for if you plan on working on this particular VM or USB in a long for an extended period of time. However, if you just want to play with the tools, work on your Linux. Stuff like that. If you are unable to properly install Kali, I suggest that you use live mode, and that'll just kickstart and run automatically from there. High availability. This is the property that expresses how closely systems approach the goal of providing 100% data availability with sufficient performance. So high availability systems are usually rated as a percentage that shows the proportion of expected uptime to total time. So some of the methods used in achieving high availability are going to be something like distributed allocation, of resources, the clustering of computers that have similar functions, load balancing, in which we can when our system becomes our servers become overloaded, we can balance them evenly, so to distribute that the power, the performance, the processing, and redundancy measures, right? So we're going to take all of these and try to make sure that we have an uptime to achieve this a high rate of uptime to achieve that high availability, right? So uptime is of 99.9 is going to be less than 9 hours um, in a year, and this is called 3 nines, right? Um, then we have something called 4 nines, so that's 99.99% uptime. So that results in less than an hour of downtime per year. However, the increase of uptime is going to increase costs, right? Because we have to use all these different methods to ensure that we are always up. So a lot of organizations and industries may deal with a certain amount of uptime. I believe I spoke to somebody that said they had 6 nines, which resulted in like something like 6 seconds or 6 minutes of downtime a year that they were allowed to have. I believe it was somewhere in the banking industry. Um, so with that increased uptime, it's going to cost you a lot to make sure that you are always available, right? Because you're going to have all those redundancy measures and allocation of resources to ensure that you always stay up. Next up, we have deployment environments. So this is going to be the process of deploying and provisioning systems, resources, and software that is accomplished through different types of environments. So in these environments, we are going to ensure that the service being deployed is thoroughly checked for compliance um, with the organization's security policies, and at the same time enabling our personnel and customers to work with the service in the most optimal way. So first up, we have development. And this is going to be something of in-house software that is designed to this is going to be in-house software that will design and then actively program that software, right? So maybe we design our own IDE that is going to allow us to or maybe we design an application, right? An application that's going to, I don't know, help us deal with shipping and receiving, right? And then we are going to code the software that is going to allow us to do that, right? And that will be development, right? So environments may have more than one development measure. And a lot of times they may be necessary for one type of resource but not the other. Another thing about in development environments, right? We might use an IDE to create our application, as I said before, but that is a type of environment. That IDE is my development environment that I am developing in, right? Then we have something called testing. So testing ensures that all asset types meet compliance requirements. So testing is a crucial step in making sure that we meet our organization's standards. And there's different types of testing methods and techniques. There are sandbox environments that can be used for software testing. So something like a sandbox would be using localhost when you're developing a website, right? So localhost will enable, so you develop in your IDE, right? So that is uh, a development environment in which we code, right? A text editor. We might use any language. So we're developing HTML and JavaScript, etc. And so we're trying to build a website. So our sandbox environment in this case, once we've designed our website, we're going to want to test that out in an environment where it can't hurt anything else, right? In a standalone environment. So we would test this in localhost and make sure that all our functionality is pretty much working as we intend. Before we, push that out to the internet at large. Then we have trusting computing bases. This is used for validating our integrity. So because we're doing this through our trusting computer base, we can validate this integrity by verifying that files and code in this environment hasn't been tampered with by comparing our hash values to their known legitimate values, right? And And then we have staging. So staging is going to involve setting up an environment through which an asset can be quickly and easily deployed for testing purposes. Um, for example, maybe we're setting up a virtual desktop infrastructure in which we'll want to develop a secure baseline and an associated master image in order to easily revert those test systems back to a known fresh state. So a testing environment will facilitate this type of streamlined administration and give us those realistic results, right? So these staging environments are going to simulate the actual production environment so that that way we know that things are actually going to work the right way. So staging, when we're talking about maybe website building, maybe we stage this on Heroku, right? So Heroku lets us host websites, and we can make sure that everything is working online the way we assume it will work. So we might not be able to test everything thoroughly in localhost, but then we can more thoroughly test everything through Heroku before we move things into production. So an asset is pushed into production after the testing concludes, right? So the asset may be developed to end users or just to enter a running state that is ready to provide a proper service, right? So in either way, it's considered live. And so at this point, we must have all our security assurances, such as high availability, right? So we've got to make sure that we have our uptime. We got to make sure that we have our authentication, everything else. So our guidelines for implementing security strategies. So when we implement these strategies, we need to supplement our manual security processes in order to increase efficiency and accuracy. We're going to want to ensure that systems are adequately scalable and can meet our long-term goals and demands as our business grows. We're going to want to make sure that our systems are elastic so they can meet a short-term increase or a decrease as our demands change over time, right? We need to make sure our critical systems have redundancy in order to mitigate that loss of data or resources in case there is some sort of problem or adverse event. We also need to ensure that critical systems are fault tolerant so that the service disruption is going to be minimized, right? We don't want to have any downtime if we can stop it, right? We want to make sure that our services don't fail, right? We need to consider using multiple storage devices in a RAID for redundancy and fault tolerance. So this is making sure that we don't lose any of this data, right? So, but we need to choose an appropriate RAID level for our redundancy and fault tolerance as well, according to our business needs, right? We might not be able to afford all this, for one, or we might not even need it. Especially for every type of data, right? Some data is more important than others, and then we want to balance that with what funds we have available. We should also consider implementing non-persistent environments. This is going to help us easily maintain our baseline of security. It's gonna help make sure that Bob from accounting doesn't screw things up, or some newly hired personnel, right? So that way we can roll back to a a a good state that we deem acceptable. Ensure that the systems are highly available. We want that uptime, especially if we're dealing with things like credit card purchases and stuff like that. And consider one or more deployment environments, incorporating those. That way that we can, develop, we can test, we can put things in a sandbox or a staging environment to make sure, hey, this is ready to go into production, right? We have created this, we have tested it, we have tested it some more in our staging right before, and make sure that everything is working across the board before we put that thing online and try to go about our business. So we have our next activity. This activity is going to be implementing virtual machine snapshots. So in this case, our VMs are subject to data destruction and tampering risk. So we're going to need to recover from these incidents. And so snapshots are going to enable us to revert to a prior secure state. Right, so a snapshot is not going all the way back to our master image. It's going to last Tuesday when everything was working out fine, right? And so you're going to need to add data to a VM, then take a snapshot, and then revert destructive behavior. So in this case, all right, we took a snapshot previously, and we've made some changes, and these changes were bad, and so now we want to revert back to that optimal state or better off state, right? A prior secure state, where we are more so meeting our baseline. All right, data security. This is the controls and measures taken to keep data safe and accessible, and used to prevent unauthorized access to it. So implementing data management processes in our security operations are going to be crucial, right? We want our data to be safe. We also want it to be casually checked on, right, to make sure its integrity remains the same, and make sure that it's up to date with our security on it is up to date with new processes and technologies. So data security. Today's workforce basically is more mobile. We have data everywhere now, right? We have data in our phone and walking around with us every day. We have data that is stored and accessed in all sorts of different locations. And so as an organization, we might not only think about the physical access to our data and our storage systems, but also the devices that are going to access them, right? So data security needs to be applied at every step of an organization, right? So we have, last I checked, we are creating as much data every year that we have in every prior year in existence, right? So in 2020, we will create more data than we have in, since 2019 to the beginning of time, right? That's the amount of data that we are creating every single year. So data security is going to be applied at a physical environment, right? So that keeping our stuff locked up. It's doing no good if we have servers and everything else if we don't keep them safe physically as well as online, right? If you have a server and you're sitting here worried about all the encryption standards and everything else you need, however, your server is on the bottom floor of a building that has 100,000 people pass through it every day, you're not really secure at all. So we also need to think about all of our traditional computing environments as well as our mobile environments. We have phones everywhere, right? So a data priority is going to be a priority for all organizations, and it needs to be incorporated into our policies. So data security vulnerabilities, these can include the increased use of cloud computing to perform job functions. With giving up things to cloud security, we are no longer in complete control of our data because we have given that up to a third party, right? So you can't control it as good as maybe you could have at your own location, right? You are responsible for your own servers at your own location. However, we are trusting Amazon or Google or somebody else to do this for us in this case. Not to say they don't do it well, but that is something to take in mind. Another vulnerability may be the lack of restricted physical access to data storage system. As I was just saying before, there's no point in only worrying about encryption and stuff like that when your servers are there's no restricted physical access to the servers in the first place. Um, what about the lack of user awareness, right? If we have users who, are susceptible to social engineering at every given point, um, our data is not secure at all. We should have a unified data policy on how we're going to adhere to these standards in order to maintain them and make sure that everybody's on board. Um, and then we might have the lack of proper data management practices. That's something that we need to set forth in our organizational standards and requirements. And then we may have poorly or obsolete encryption solutions. If we're using an encryption scheme from 1985 and it's 2020, it's a pretty good chance that that encryption standard um, is no longer up to par and can be defeated by the weakest of smartphones, right? We are all walking around with what used to be a supercomputer, 20 years ago. And then maybe you have the lack of proper identity and access management practices. So everything isn't for everybody, right? If every one of your users can access financial data and make changes as they want to, well, that is a huge vulnerability right there, because they can sit here and change your sales data. They can sit here and change your payroll. They can sit here and delete everything you have, right? So there are tons of different vulnerabilities that can lead to unauthorized access to data and that data leakage. Um, Next up, we have data storage methods. So, these data storage methods, first off, we have DAS. So that is direct attached storage. This is a traditional network server. We'll have one or more devices directly attached to a server. And we're going to see this on our test referred to as DAS, right? DAS. Then we have a network attached storage. So this could be, this is an appliance that facilitates storage and the serving of files over a network. So in most cases, a NAS appliance is going to contain multiple storage devices and provide faster data access than a traditional file server. And it's easier for us to manage and configure this. And then we have storage area networks, and these are going to be dedicated networks. They are dedicated specifically to storage, and these can provide us with block level data storage. And then also with network attached storage, back to that, we can create network attached storage where, let's say we have a whole bunch of different computers on our network. Well, we can share the storage between all of those with network attached storage. Those multiple storage devices across the board. And then we have cloud-based storage. So cloud-based storage is a service-based storage, right? It's going to be hosted by a third party. Your Azure's, your Google's, your Amazon. Most of us are probably using some sort of cloud-based storage. I know I am. So like Google, your iCloud account, right? If you save your backups to your iPhones on your iCloud account, you are using a cloud-based storage. If you use Google Photos and Google Drive, that is Google Photos is a cloud-based storage. Amazon has one as well. Maybe you want to be aware of the fact that hey, you're not actually paying for Google's Google Photos, so there's probably something in those terms and conditions, those bunch of pages, deeming what access Google actually has to it, right? Because everything is not free, even though it seems to be, right? In the case of Facebook, their business model is your data, right? So same thing here. So be aware of, free cloud services, because everything is not free. You're paying in one way or another. So we have data encryption methods. So in order to protect our data from security vulnerabilities, we're going to want to apply data encryption that is appropriate to our data level. So a full disk encryption will encrypt an entire disk and all the data stored upon it. So if you have, you can do this on a lot of different devices. Your computer at home, your laptop. We see this on cell phones. iPhone enables full disk encryption by default. So that way, every time when you first turn on your phone, you have to put in a code before you can, and that will decrypt the full disk encryption. And before you can see like maybe what the number of that person was had just called you or something like that, right? Or before maybe you have access to your camera. And then for Android, that last I had an Android, you had to enable that in the settings. Um, then we have database encryption. Database encryption is used to encrypt our sensitive data that's stored in the database. And some organizations are going to need to comply with regulatory guidelines that are going to require that they encrypt that data, especially if it's a specific type of data. Um, However, not everybody is actually encrypting these databases. So some of your information may be saved in clear text, right? Um, be aware of that. I've several companies have been got caught with their databases being saved in clear text. I want to say Facebook was just recently found to store passwords in the clear not too long ago. Um, File encryption. So, file encryption protects individual files that may contain private or confidential data. So we can encrypt a specific file, right? Maybe you got that photo album you don't want anybody to see, right? You can encrypt that um, on top of your regular encryption, your full disk encryption. So maybe you have full disk encryption, you have to put in a password to get on to unencrypt your desktop or something like that, and then you go to your folders, and then you have another file that you encrypt on top of that, and have to put in another password to decrypt that as well, right? So kind of layered there. Then we'll have removable media encryption. So this would be like our SD cards, USBs, things of that nature. We can have mobile device encryption, which is what I was talking about earlier. We can do full disk encryption with that, but there are lower levels of encryption on mobile devices. So maybe we don't have full disk encryption, but we have like application level encryption or something like that. Um, and then we have email encryptions. So this is used to encrypt and protect our emails from being read by somebody sitting in the middle, right? From unauthorized users. So we have SMIME, so that's Secure Multipurpose Internet Mail Extensions. We have PGP, which was pretty good privacy, and GPG, which was GNU Privacy Guard. And all of these utilities provide encryption functionality. And then finally, we have voice encryptions that are going to try to protect our voice communications and data across our networks, right? Over the phone, through the wire. In this case, there are several applications which can provide encryptions. Maybe you've seen on TV where, some government officials, they're talking and they're like, hey, are you on a secure line, right? So in that case, we're trying to make sure that yes, we are actually encrypted so nobody's listening in on our conversation. I think Wicker Me allows you to do that. um Data sensitivity. So not all data is equal. So the purpose of one data set may differ from the purpose of another, right? We all have all this data is treated differently based upon what it is. Um, so when it comes to this information, we need to assign a particular label to it, right? And this label is going to define how we're going to handle that data in respect to its access, its modification. Um, it's going to be based on its sensitivity and define how we handle it, right? And so these are we might have different labels depending on what type of organization we are, right? We might have you know secret, top secret, etc. Um, Public trust. However, these are other labels that are rather common. So we have public. So public information is going to be available public data is going to be available to all or most people. Example of this would be a product catalog or something like that, right? So it has little to few restrictions on the terms of access. However, we should still try to make sure that nobody is gonna change its integrity, right, or modify it, or mess up its availability, right? If we the stuff on Amazon.com is publicly available, but we don't want anybody taking down Amazon. If we work for them, or we we are a stakeholder there, because hey, we need our business to be up and running, right? Then we have private information. So this is going to be available to the organization only, right? So this is going to be our company secrets. So taking that back to Amazon, right? This is going to be information that will be maybe their business analytics, right, on how good their sales are going on any given day, or for any given product or product type, right? Sales data, stuff like that. And then we're gonna have well, maybe not so much sales data, but then we have restricted information. Sales data was probably be in this restricted area, possibly because, okay, hey, we're dealing with select personnel here, so maybe payroll data would only be available to HR, or the finance department or something like that, right? And then maybe IT is only with IT, or maybe IT is the only one that gets access to other people's locations in our other departments, because hey, IT needs to get in there and fix things when there's a problem. And then we have confidential. So confidential is going to be available to the organization and the client. So that's going to be PII. So our confidential information will be, our usernames, passwords, maybe your shopping history, right? If we're talking about Amazon once again, right? So it's public that you can go on Amazon. However, it is confidential to just you and Amazon what you have bought, right? Or where your address is, or stuff like that, right? Um, so that would be more so confidential. And next up, we have data management roles. So when it comes to managing data, we might want to divide these responsibilities into different roles, and so these roles are that we're going to talk about here, kind of describe the relationship that somebody has with the data. And so each role is still going to work towards the overall security of the data, just in their own way. You will see these on your test as well. You might get a certain scenario saying, you know, um, this person is complying with privacy laws and regulations, and ensures that clients only have access to their own data, um, and we want to keep things private and confidential, etc. So maybe this is going to be a privacy officer. So maybe, well, that would be a privacy officer, but maybe we get like three different people, maybe a CEO, a janitor, and a lawyer. So maybe that describes a lawyer, right? Maybe that's going to be the question that you get. Which one of these, which what type of person might be a privacy officer, right? So we have up first, we have an owner. So the owner is the person responsible for the data, the ultimately responsible person for the data. So maybe this is our manager, or our CEOs, or something like that, CFO. So they are responsible for labeling that data, such as so that meaning who should have access to this data, and also determining how critical or sensitive this data actually is. And then they need to ensure that it's protected with the appropriate controls, such as access control, backups, things of that nature. So the owner is going to be the one that's going to select the custodian. And so our data custodian is going to be most likely an IT operations personnel, who's going to have responsibility, ongoing responsibility, um, to manage that data. So they're going to apply the technical controls that were requested by the owner, and then they are going to perform, backups, ensure the security, make sure we're in our baselines. And then we have a privacy officer. So the privacy officer, this is going to be the person that is going to raise concerns, privacy concerns for individual users. So we have, as an organization, probably have an obligation to ensure that our data is not leaked to the public. So our privacy officer is going to ensure that our systems are set up in a way that clients are able to view their own private information, but not others. And then a lot of times this privacy officer will have to make sure that we're in compliance with the laws and rules and regulations. So this may or may not be a technical person, but this may be dealing with lawyers and stuff like that as well, because of those need to comply with laws and regulations. But so there's several different types of privacy officers in that sense. And then we have users. So users are going to be not directly responsible for managing that data, right? However, they are responsible for adhering to the security policies of your organization to make sure that they don't put the data at risk, right? So, don't leak passwords and stuff on Facebook, right? But they're not responsible in the same way that the IT guy is responsible, right? Data retention. So data retention is going to be the process of an organization maintaining the existence of and control over certain data for compliance purposes. We got to make sure that we are in compliance with any applicable laws and regulations. So in a lot of cases, an organization is actually required to retain data for a certain amount of time. For example, a healthcare provider needs to retain audit logs for several years as mandated by HIPAA, right? However, an employee may be required to retain, that same provider, that same healthcare provider may need to retain their employee correspondence over email for a much shorter duration of time. Then we have organizations that need to balance retention with our privacy requirements. All organizations need to do that. So personal identifiable information and personal health information shouldn't be held for too long, because the longer we hold that, the longer we expose it to potential risks. So our retention policies need to integrate with our disposal policies. So we may, keep employee retina data or something like that, fingerprint data, for a certain amount of time. However, we might have a retention policy which states, after 5 years after severing relations with that company, we dispose of this, or something of that case, right? Where maybe we're dealing with a DNA gathering company, 23andMe and all that. So they might have something like that in their data retention policies for a timeline as to when they need to destroy your DNA sample. But to my knowledge, most of them do not have that, which is a concern of many people when it comes to these DNA testing companies, because they tend to keep your data. And so if you are one that's looking into that, you might want to definitely look over those privacy policies and retention policies to make sure that hopefully they're disposing of your data. So we have a bunch of different ways we can dispose of data. We have sanitization. So sanitization, we might call this wiping, we might call it purging. However, the goal here is to completely remove all the data at the virtual level of a storage medium. So the physical medium is not harmed, and it can be repurposed. I believe that the government standard for sanitization using software tools is to write over them at least 7 times with all 0 bits or random bits of data. Because when we delete something on our computers, or phones, whatever, what have you, it is not actually deleted until it is written over. So first you put something in the recycle bin and then you press delete. Well, guess what? Somebody can go back and use a recovery tool to regain that data as long as it hasn't been written over. Um, and even if it has been written over, things tend to be stored in different storage locations. So maybe you still get bits and pieces of that information back. Um, Degaussing. Degaussing is a strong magnetic force which is applied to a disk drive to remove its magnetic charge. Um, this is only going to work with magnetic media such as hard drives, HDDs, hard disk drives. So it's a physical process. It's going to make these media types inoperable. This will also work like on videotapes and stuff like that. It's pretty much a magnet that will degauss these and sanitize them, right? However, solid state drives cannot be degaussed, so just keep that in mind. It's only for magnetic media such as HDDs and videotapes, stuff like that. Then we have shredding. So shredding is a large industrial machine that is going to slice a storage devices in a bunch of pieces, right? And it's going to make sure that we can't fix the drive or get any of the pieces back, right? So shredding can also refer to paper shredding. So we've all seen the movie. Somebody's about to get the IRS is about to go hit somebody, and they all the companies start shredding all the papers as quick as they can, right? And then for added security, we might use pulping. So pulping is going to break down the shredded paper and remove all the ink. So this is when you definitely want to make sure that nobody sees what you've been up to, right? And then we have pulverizing. So pulverizing is going to be an industrial machine that is going to crush that device until the components, the physical device is completely destroyed. All the data is destroyed. And then, of course, we can burn things, right? So we might do this for paper records, but we can also burn storage devices. It'll probably take a little while, but it'll be completely destroyed in that case. So on top of that, maybe we just do all 5 of these and completely make sure that this data is never, ever, ever recovered. When it comes to sanitization, there are a couple tools that are used. I believe one is called Darren's Nuke and Boot. You will likely see that on your test as well. It might give you some options, what tools you may want to use for sanitization. That would be one of them. So our guidelines for managing data security. When managing data security, we're going to want to apply data security at all levels of our organization, from top to bottom, right? We are only as strong as our weakest link. So we want to review the various ways that data can become vulnerable to compromise. We're going to want to choose a data storage method that is most appropriate for our business needs. Not all businesses have the same needs, right? Or don't need the same level of security. You don't need armed guards if you are baking cookies, most likely. Or selling fruit, unless you're Chiquita Banana. Look that one up. Definitely, Chiquita Banana has been known to employ armed guards in some of tropical locations. Also, choose a data encryption method that's most appropriate for your data security needs. So we want to make sure we're using something that's strong, right? In any case, but also maybe when we want to have something that's strong and fast. So maybe we're going to use elliptical curves in that case. Also, we're going to want to label the data according to its sensitivity and its purpose. We're going to want to that way we know how serious this is, right? And make sure that the person responsible, that we have the appropriate people responsible for the appropriate type of data. And we're keeping the wrong people out. Divide data management responsibilities into multiple roles and varying duties. Then we're going to want to determine our data retention requirements as well as mandated by law, because some of these data requirements have laws behind them stating how long you are supposed to keep this data, or how long you or how you're supposed to dispose of this data. So we need to determine that. Then we're going to want to balance our data requirements with privacy requirements. We want to make sure that that our customer concerns and privacy is met. And then dispose of data securely by using any of these different methods that we've talked about: degaussing, pulverizing, burning. Uh, and then consider whether a disposal method actually destroys the physical medium. So maybe we want to make sure we do that as well. However, that also applies to your business needs. Can you afford to keep on buying all new um, storage mediums every time you want to get rid of some data? Maybe we should just stick to sanitizing. So we have our next activity, and that is going to be destroying data securely. So Develotech wants to migrate some of its data from in-house to cloud storage, and data is confidential and cannot fall into the wrong hands. So after we've mitigated this to the cloud, we want to repurpose this device. However, the person who deleted and repurposes the device actually failed on securely disposing of that data. So in this case, we are going to demonstrate the mistake and correct it by zeroing that device out and making sure all that data is securely wiped. So you will be using a recovery program called Recuva. You can use that at home if you've deleted something you didn't want to, maybe a term paper or something like that. Maybe pictures of your kids. But yeah, be sure to check that out after you've done the activity and learned how to use it. Then we have our next activity, which is encrypting a storage device. So in this case, we want to make sure that our devices are secure, right? So we just securely wipe the device, and we want to make sure it's repurposed properly. And so to prevent any of our data to be in the wrong hands, we are going to want to encrypt our storage devices, right? So some of this data needs to stay in house, and we're going to encrypt this storage devices holding that data to ensure this. So in this case, we are going to use a tool called Disk Cryptor, and that is a disk encryption tool. Physical security controls. Once again, if you have no physical controls, you are honestly not doing much to protect your data. So, all the virtual controls that we have are not going to stop somebody from entering our place of business and stealing our computers, or breaking them, setting them on fire, whatever they want to do, right? Maybe they just go through there and degauss everything because they feel like it, or throw water on everything, whatever, right? So we need physical controls as part of our overall security operation, and we definitely don't want them walking out with everything, right? So physical security controls are used to restrict, detect, and monitor access to physical areas or assets, right? So we can control access to our buildings. We can control access to equipment, specific areas. This might be a server room, finance, a legal area, data center, network cable runs, all the hardware that we deem important, to have important value and sensitivity to our organization. We're going to want to have physical controls on that, right? So we're going to determine where we need to locate physical access controls, and decide how much of a cost benefit we have by implementing some of these controls, right? And so there are several different ways that we are going to categorize these controls. So deterrence are going to discourage attackers from attacking in the first place, right? So maybe a deterrent maybe it's a sign, right? Look, keep out, right? But some people look, don't care about your sign, right? They're just gonna go in there anyway. Um, so then we have preventative control. So this stops an attack before it could cause damage. So here's my deterrent, right? You might have a sign at your house that says, keep out, or dog, beware of dog or something, and somebody might be like, man, forget that dog. I'll kick him, right? And then they decide that they're going to try to walk straight into your door. Well, guess what your preventative control is? Hopefully, you've locked your door, right? Um, and then we have a detective control, right? So let's say your door was unlocked, or maybe he got past your lock, right? So a detective control is going to identify an attack in process. So this detective control, maybe it's a camera, maybe it's ADT or something like that, right? You have a security system, and so that's going to alert you to the attack in progress. So then we have corrective controls. So corrective controls are going to try to restore our system to a state prior to the attack, or maybe otherwise mitigate um, the effects of that attack. So sticking with somebody trying to break into your home, or place of business, maybe if you've seen on the movies, right, when somebody breaks in and some of the alarm goes off, and the gates close, and now they're trapped in that place, right? So that would be a corrective control in that case, right? Um, then we have compensating controls. These are controls that are an alternative option when the required or desired control can't be fully implemented in place. So maybe we wanted an IPS, an intrusion protection system. However, we can only afford the IDS. Um, maybe you wanted to release dogs on people, but you didn't have you don't have a Doberman. You only had a Chihuahua. Hey, that's what we're using it to compensate for that. Maybe the Chihuahua's loud, right? Um, then we have technical controls. So technical controls are hardware or software that aid in the protecting of physical assets, right? That is a technical control. And then we have administrative controls. So this is going to be our policies that we have for our personnel. And then, just be aware that some of these are going to be in multiple categories, right? So if you have a camera is going to it's going to deter people, hopefully, from going to breaking into somewhere, right? Because they're going to see the camera, and they're going to be like, yeah, maybe I shouldn't do that. And it'll also detect, right? Because it'll tell you that somebody has been there. However, hopefully your camera actually works and it's not just a deterrent, because some people, as I said before, are just going to be like, forget that camera. Um, then we have different physical security control types. So we should all be very much aware of these control types, because these are things that we are using in our everyday lives when it comes to things like locks, right? We have bolting locks, right? So bolting door locks are the traditional lock that we all have. So in this case, maybe we have a non-duplicate policy for keys to access a door. So that means we're going to make sure that, hey, we're not allowed to have duplicates of this key. We might have combination locks. We might have a keypad, or a dialing system or something. We may have electronic door locks that use an access card, right? With an electronic chip or a token, right? And you stick it into the door, boom, you're in. We might have biometrics. So we might, stick our thumb on there, or it might scan our iris, and then that'll allow us access to that door. And then we have, our hardware locks. So these hardware locks are also called cable locks. So this is something that we might actually put, like, so maybe we have a fence or a gate around our servers, and we put a hardware lock on top of that. Or maybe we have a hardware lock that is attached to our work computers, to the floor or something like that, to make sure somebody doesn't just pick it up and walk off with it, right? or maybe our filing cabinets, right? Filing cabinets usually have a key for them to make sure that nobody can just open them up except for the person authorized to open them up. And speaking of keys, we have keys that need to be secured from unauthorized access. So we should have physical key management practices that are going to maybe hopefully involve a master key that's going to lock up all the other keys in a secure cabinet, right? And then we're going to have policies in place that's going to say who can access those keys and how who can access them and why and how. And then we're going to have an auditing trail behind that, right? So maybe that person has to sign this key out and say, okay, yes, I had to use this key at this point in time, right? And then we have logging and visitor access. So we need to log entry at all public entrances. So visitors, they need to sign in with certain information. And so you guys, as going forward to take your Security Plus, some of these buildings you're going to be going into that offer Security Plus by Pearson VUE. Pearson VUE may be located at a different part of the building, right? And so when you walk into that building, there's typically a person sitting there, a security guard, and they'll have a sign-in sheet. You're going to provide your ID. You're going to say, okay, who you are. You're going to write that down. You're going to say the date and time. You're going to say who you're going to visit, right? And the reason for that, right? So it might say reason for visiting test, and the organization is going to be not CompTIA, but Pearson VUE. And then we have video surveillance. So video surveillance comes in forms of CCTV, which is closed circuit television, or IP cameras, right? So closed circuit television is going to be used only in your place of business, right? Or it's a closed circuit, right? But IP cameras are operating online to show, like, you can log into your IP camera and see what's going on there. One thing of note here is that IP cameras, a lot of times people are not securing those cameras, and there are a bunch of websites online where you can actively look at unsecured IP cameras, and these IP cameras can be found all over the globe, from places of business such as a automotive shop to somebody's living room to the beach to a highway, etc. Right? So we need to make sure that we are securing those IP cameras for sure, and definitely, not just only securing them normally, making sure that we have changed our default passwords, because those are very easily found. And so we should also, when it comes to CCTV and IP, we should typically make sure that we are saving and securing the data, because hey, we may need to go back and catch something that we may not have been noticed the first time it was recorded, or maybe we never check our recordings unless something happens. Some organizations only check cameras when something happens, and there's nobody actually monitoring the camera at any given time. So these should be saved so that way we can go back and monitor them and audit them. In continuing physical security control types, we have security guards, right? Human guards, of course, can be placed around any location, right? At the front of a location, around a location. They're able to monitor checkpoints and verify people's identification. They can allow or disallow people to come in. They can deter people from a bad actor from trying to come in. And then they can also provide their own knowledge and intuition and experience into any given situation, right? And when it comes to monitoring checkpoints and stuff like that, there are some security guards that not only just stay at one location, but they have to walk around. And the way that that we ensure that they walk around is placing checkpoints, actual physical checkpoints that they have to scan their ID with as they make their rounds. So they would have to maybe ensure this way that somebody has gone through this area at least once every hour or every half hour, whatever the case that your business decides to use. Then we have signs. So signs are simple, right? However, they work against people that are not determined to get in places, right? No trespassing, and somebody might be like, "Oh man, well, I guess I can't go in here." Um, However, they're not going to stop anybody that is determined um, to actually try to get in somewhere, right? Or also like a security vendor sign. So having that thing saying, this home is secured by ADT, right? That's one of them. So this may convince people to stay away. However, it may not. Um, lighting. Lighting is a good one. Lighting is going to deter intruders, hopefully, who try to conceal themselves in the dark, right? A lot of people, if a light turns on, they'll go away, right? If they're up to no good. Spotlights help guards detect people. They could put something directly on an intruder, right? And then we have something always on room lights, preventing people from hiding once they're inside a building. So you see a whole lot of tons of organizations and stores and things that leave the lights on no matter what time it is, and that's one way of trying to prevent people from hiding internally, and also it deters people from trying to get into somewhere that's lighting, right? Um, Someone that's lighted. My neighbor happened to, well, actually, the majority of my neighborhood was had their cars broken into not too long ago, and several of my neighbors decided that they were going to put up cameras and lighting in order to de- deter people. Right, the lighting that's that turns on due to motion detection. Right. However, he has one light that shines directly into my windows, which has caused me to have to go get blackout curtains. Um, Next up, on top of that, we have something called a man trap door. A man trap door is also referred to as a dead man's door. So it's a system in which we have a door at each end of a chamber, right? Um, Kind of like how in some stores you go through one door and then you go through another, and usually that one's there to like protect, from the elements and stuff like that. But it can be used in a case where an individual will enter the one door before the inner door opens up, and then also somebody can verify who that person is before they allow them within the inner door. Um, I actually saw, well, going back to AWS, I had to sign in with security, and on top of that, I had to sign an NDA, and then they had a man trap door, um, and I had to wait there until the next security guard who was going to escort me to where we were having the meetup at, right? He had to verify that, hey, I had my visitor badge before I got to go to the meetup location. I also seen this with um, a pawn shop, uh, not too far from here, in which they had a man trap door. So you walked into the pawn shop, and they had to buzz you into the second door. And beyond that, they also had everything behind bulletproof glass, and they had a kind of a spinning door in which you could put your money in, and he could turn back and give your whatever product you decided to buy from him. I thought that was some extreme security for a pawn shop, but hey. Um, Moving forward, we have physical barriers, right? So that was kind of a physical barrier in that case, keeping anybody from stealing anything from their pawn shop. However, there's other barriers, right? Highly secure rooms shouldn't be visible from the outside. We don't want people to know they really exist in the first place, um, or get an idea of how to get to them, right? Um, However, we can um, we can use those. Other things in lieu of that, right? So we can use gates, we can use fencing, we can use cages. I worked at a warehouse in which we kept all of our um, our industrial machinery, um, and our industrial cleaners and chemicals within its own cage with a lock on top of that, right? So not only did we have a warehouse, but we had a caged in area in which only the people that needed to operate those machineries were able to get into that cage. Then we can also have barricades, and bollards. Bollards are actually those are those if you've ever been to a store where they have those concrete cylinders outside the door, between the sidewalk and the street. Those are there to make sure that you don't crash into the store, right? Um, they use them. They use them downtown Washington D.C. around some of the more secure federal locations, larger ones actually. Some of them are designed to look um, like appealing to the eye, like they might be like a large pot with a tree in them. But the effect is that they're supposed to stop somebody from crashing into something, right? They're typically made out of cement. Um, Next up, we have secure containers. So, secure containers we're going to need to secure our keys, right? And physical sensitive um, assets. So, we can have a secure cabinet that's going to store our keys or small electronics, and that might be held by a master key, right? And then secure enclosures can hold our bulkier hardware, right? And then we can also use safes. So a safe is going to be used as a secure container, just like the small personal safes at the banks and stuff like that, safe deposit boxes. And this may provide protection against things that a traditional cabinet couldn't have protected against. Um, Faraday cages. So Faraday cage is a wire mesh container that is the size of up to from a room to the size of a bag, right? And it's designed to block external electromagnetic fields and is used to prevent wireless signal interference. And it is useful for preserving the integrity of a wireless electronic device. So, um, when it comes to small devices, and examining these devices, right? Say there's a drug dealer, right? Oftentimes you can find uh, their sensitive information, containing evidence of their crimes on a cell phone, right? And so a an investigator may or may not put that phone into a small Faraday cage the size of a bag, to ensure that the suspect does not remotely wipe or have somebody else remotely wipe that device right before they can investigate it. Um, Also, they could have a secure enclosure the size of a room in which they can investigate that device to make sure, once again, it's not remotely wiped and it doesn't receive any other transmissions, right? So that would be a big purpose of a Faraday cage. So we're trying to block people from sending commands to these devices, and apparently it has been a big issue in which have been remotely wiping devices once they come in contact with law enforcement. Um, I'm not so sure that local law enforcement enforces this. However, somebody um, who knows about uh, the threat of somebody doing this, maybe some of our three-letter agencies will be more in tune with using Faraday cages in their search and seizures. Um, and investigations. Screen filters. So screen filters are attached to screens to restrict their viewing angle, and only authorized personnel sit in front of that screen and see it just fine, and a passerby or anybody nearby them can't really see it. So if you sat at the bank where not in the line where you see the teller, but they where you sit into the office with a bank employee. So normally they have these filters. They're sitting there, they're looking up all your information, and you're kind of, and their screen's kind of tilted to the side. You can't see anything there. That is because they are using a screen filter because you're at an angle and you cannot see that. And anybody passing by cannot see that. So that is an example of a screen filter you may have already seen in everyday life. Um, I've seen people with screen filters on their cell phones, but I would find that particularly annoying on a cell phone because I'm going to use it at any angle I can in some cases. So this will, help from people maybe shoulder surfing, right? Entering your passwords. I would say this is it's probably pretty good for something like an ATM or something like that. Alarms should be up next. Alarms are activated when there's an unauthorized attempt to, and it requires a quick response, right? So we could have a security guard that is in place locally that can respond quickly, or maybe we have a police officer that is able to respond to the alarms. Um, and these alarms can also trigger other things, right? So maybe this alarm triggers more security to an already vulnerable location or a prized location that we definitely don't want nobody accessing. Maybe it starts more security there. Maybe or or maybe like I said, like in the movies, if you've seen where somebody tries to break in and they trip the alarm of a vault or something, and all the doors automatically close down on them, right? So that would be one case in which an alarm triggered more bars to access. And then we have motion detection. So that can trip an alarm, right? So we'll have sensors that will trip an alarm, or we'll have sensors that will trip um, that'll trip lighting, right? And this can be placed at a checkpoint within or without or outside of a building. We can use infrared, Mission Impossible style, right? Microwave or ultrasonic detection, right? Sound. Um, and then we have protection distribution. So protected distribution is are systems that are intended to make it difficult for an attacker to compromise cabling. Right? Um, and cables are then hardened with metallic tubing and acoustic alarm systems. They're supposed to be inspected by qualified personnel um, to make sure that anything didn't go off. A lot of times these are going to have alarms to them. Uh, when they do have the alarms, I've heard stories, especially in this Washington D.C. area, in which I have a friend that works for a utility company, and when they go to dig up some of the utilities they have, they tend to hit some of these cablings that are not on their schematics, and these happen to be governmental cablings that they didn't provide these utility companies notification that they were actually there, and then maybe somebody shows up from that governmental agency in a black truck somewhere and tries to see what's going on here, right? Um, so that is protected distribution. We have also environmental exposures coming up. So, an environmental exposure is something that we need to consider when we evaluate our overall security on a building, right? Because we can be exposed to lightning, hurricanes, earthquakes, volcanoes, high winds, right? So, this is going to depend on where you are actually located. If you are located in Hawaii, you're going to have to worry about volcanic eruptions. If you're in Florida or Puerto Rico, as of late, you're going to have to worry about hurricanes. If you're located in Oklahoma, you might have to worry about a tornado coming through. So these are all extreme weather events that we have to think about for our buildings, because maybe we end up with power fluctuations or damage to the buildings or fires. Um, in this case, CompTIA has decided unauthorized access being allowed in the case of a one of these environmental exposures. I don't know what they're alluding to here. Maybe there is an earthquake which brings down a wall to a server, and somebody's sitting there waiting because this is their shot to gather all of Developtech's information. But moving forward, we have several different environmental controls that we can control, right? You might not be able to control the weather, but we can control these. And first up is HVAC. So HVAC is system controls the environment inside of a building, right? It regulates humidity and temperature controls. Um, it's recommended that these temperatures are between 72 and 76 degrees Fahrenheit in a computer facility, and we should keep our humidity somewhere between 40 and 60%, right? And this is not, um, if we do not adhere to this, we can end up with corrosion, um, and damage our circuits, right? Uh, I knew of a guy that they set up a whole bunch of private keys on a laptop and stuck it into a safe. And then when they went to retrieve these keys several years later, they got the laptop and it was corroded and pretty much destroyed. Um, so in that case, it didn't get the correct airflow, right? Um, then we have well, on top of that, we're going to want to monitor our HVAC system. So we need to make sure that our HVAC system is filtering out the dust, is making sure that we are within the right temperature range and humidity range, and we ensure that by monitoring them both locally and remotely, right? And then we have something called a hot and a cold aisle. This will definitely also be on your test. Um, this is this is a method in which data centers and computer rooms control temperature and humidity. So with strategically placed vents and exhaust fans, right? So cold air is going to travel from a cold aisle in front of the server rack or the cabinet to an intake, and then it's pushed out the other side of the racks where it comes out as hot air exhaust, right? It comes out the other side of those aisles. Those are the hot aisles, right? So it usually comes from the floor. The cold aisle comes from the floor and then up and out. So this we want to keep hardware at our desired room temperature and humidity, and that is one of the ways we are going to do it with that hot and cold aisle. Um, then we have an alarm control panel. So we should try to keep this panel protected from exposure because we don't want any false alarms. We also don't want to press an alarm and it doesn't work because it wasn't protected. So the panel needs to be in a separate location and protected from unauthorized access. However, it needs to be accessible to that fire department. And we should also encase this in a waterproof climate control box that is powered by a dedicated circuit. So that way, in case there's any power fluctuations or whatever, we don't lose that. And it needs to be programmed to function by the particular zone within an organization. Continuing on with these environmental controls, we have fire prevention. So, of course, the first rule of fire protection is going to be fire prevention, right? So fires are prevented by eliminating unnecessary storage items, conducting annual inspections, right? You might want to include the fire department with this and review our our computer room controls. We may want to install fire suppression systems and fireproof walls and floors and ceilings, and using fire resistant materials, right? Um, when it comes to fire detection, we should have these connected to a central reporting system. Our fire detection systems should be connected to a central reporting station. And it should indicate where the suspected fire is. In some cases, maybe this is connected directly to a fire department, right? So we have various different fire detection systems that identify how much of a threat a fire actually is. So smoke detectors sense the presence of a fire, of smoke actually, um, by testing for particles in the air. Fires can be suppressed through handheld extinguishers. Um, what else? Heat sensors. When we're talking about detection, right? Heat sensors can be triggered when there's a specific temperature reached in the area, right? And then we have flame detectors. So we might have an optical sensor to let us know that something is going on, right? Environmental monitoring. Hmm. Going back actually, when it comes to fire suppression, um, water is not always practical to extinguish fires. And so, since we're dealing with computers, we need to understand the fact that we might need to use a special type of gas. So, this gas is going to make sure that we don't damage our computing operations with water. Um, so, bear that in mind. Um, Environmental monitoring, it is critical that we regularly monitor for environmental issues. So we need to monitor those controls and conditions. Um, this is going to reduce the risk of damage to our hardware and other properties. Um, we are going to monitor the system, and hopefully we are able to you interface that monitoring system with the existing controls that we already have. Some controls actually have their own monitoring mechanisms, right? An HVA system likely has the ability to provide real-time reports on the humidity and temperature, right? To an ad hoc console. Um, and then we may be able to also provide reports to an administrator's computer in a cicada system, right? I mean, in a SCADA system. Um, in some instances, maybe we have constant video monitoring to ensure that there's no water damage or there's no fire going on, right? Or electricity issues. Maybe our monitor didn't actually pick that up, so the only way for us to reveal that is through video, through the human eye. Safety. Um, the safety of our employees and our property is, of course, important to our overall security. So it's vital to have that in place in order to keep our operation running efficiently. So examples of safety controls, this might be fencing and CCTV or IPTV. This may help to deter intruders from harming our assets. We might put locks on doors. We should put locks on doors, especially to hazardous areas where we're using heavy machinery, and making sure that anybody doesn't have access to that. Our employees aren't always the going to do the brightest things. Um, Proper lighting during the night. It's going to help. It's going to help that our employees are safe from any accidents as a result of having bad visibility. Um, we probably need an escape plan where I think that's mandated in certain places to have an escape plan for fires. Maybe you have one for noxious gas, so we need to formulate a plan of escape for our employees. Um, we need to map escape routes, right? And that way our employees know the best way to get out in the event of an unsafe situation. And however, hey, we can have all this planned out, mapped out, but unless our employees are actively performing drills to be prepared for one of these adverse events, they're probably not going to get it done right. So we're going to want to perform drills the same way you perform drills when you perform fire drills in school. Um, that's why we would perform things at work, right? At work, we should have a fire drill, active shooter drill, etc. Um, I'm, I believe I read somewhere where fire drills actually became a mandate because of a fire in Chicago in like the 20s or something, in which like over 100 students had died at the school. So there is a reason for doing all this, even though that people become people become lazy when it comes to this at times because nothing's ever happening. Um, it is an important measure. So safety controls are subject to wear and tear, and we need to make sure that there's no point in time where our personnel and property are going to be left vulnerable. Um, so we need to consistently test our controls and make sure that they meet the safety standards. Maybe our TV doesn't work, our CCTV doesn't work anymore. Maybe the locks are not getting locked, or the fence is falling down, right? Or maybe the escape plan is no longer viable. We need to fix and replace this. So guidelines for implementing security controls. Physical controls. When implementing a physical control, we're going to want to conduct a cost benefit analysis to determine the physical control viability. Meaning, once again, if we are in the gold business, we probably want a lot of security to make sure that nobody's coming in there and stealing our gold. However, if we are in the cookie business, we probably don't need as much security, and it's probably not going to be worth the money it would cost us to secure that place down to the same lengths that somebody who is dealing in precious metals. Um, Identify any regulations that require certain physical controls. So you may have regulations in place that are going to decide how you need to control personally identifiable information, health information, biometric information, etc. Implement a wide variety of physical control types that are appropriate to your facilities and other environments. Hey, we there's no point in having a guard on a business that operates entirely online, right? So we kind of need to make sure that it's relevant. Uh, we may not need may not need like flood guards or something like that in the desert. Um, Recognize how your environments are exposed to environmental conditions. Hey, be aware that if you're operating in California, you might just have an earthquake, right? Um, if you're in Oklahoma, your roof might get tore off. If you're in New Orleans, the levees may break again, right? So we need to be aware of this. Um, Implement environmental controls such as HVAC and fire management, right? So we need to make sure we reduce the exposure risk to having a fire or having our systems corrode because it's full of humidity, right? We need to control that. We need to make sure that our systems are running at an optimal level, performance level, and we can help to do that by making sure that the environmental conditions are as good as they can be. Um, we need to ensure that environmental exposures are constantly monitored. There's no point in having all these systems and we have no idea whether they're working or not. Ensure the safety of personnel and property is a priority. Hey, our personnel hopefully are number one in our organization, and we want to ensure the safety of that personnel. And hey, this is an organization, so after the safety of our personnel, then we need to make sure that our property is secure. Consider how existing physical controls can be used as safety controls. So existing physical controls could be fences and cameras, right? And those and lighting, right? So hey, that's a physical control to make sure that people aren't hiding in the dark during lighting, but also it's making sure that our employees aren't tripping over some sort of wire or something as they're walking through the building. Um, Develop an escape plan in the event of noxious gases or fires. Our employees probably need to know the quickest way out of the building in that case. And conduct period drills to test personnel preparedness. We need to make sure that our personnel are prepared to leave in the case of an adverse event. And we also need to make sure that they've covered everything they need to do. Maybe somebody needs to be in charge of this event. That way, we're making sure that all of our people aren't running around kind of like with their heads cut off, basically. And then we want to ensure that safety controls are consistently tested. Hey, we got to make sure that they actually work, right? There's no point in having a camera unless you're just trying to deter people. That's not actually recording, right? We need to make sure, hey, if something adverse did go on, our cameras actually work, so that way, hey, we can find out who may have done it, who may have breached us. So, implementing physical controls is our final activity for this chapter. Developtech plans on relocating its main headquarters. The CSO, that being the Chief Security Officer, wants your input on necessary physical security. What controls should you implement to protect the assets and personnel of your organization?